Hello, everybody. And tonight or today, or whenever you're watching this video, this is the time period one review. So we're going to take the information for AP World History from 1200 and 1450, and we're going to expand upon it. And this is going to include units one and two. So we're going to be looking at 2 units from the 9 unit curriculum of AP World History. And of course, all of this is to help you prepare for the AP exam. What I would just caution you is not to get too obsessed about every minute detail. The idea is that if you have this working general knowledge, really you want to be able to work with that knowledge and apply historical thinking skills to it. So this is more of a detail-oriented lecture with the idea of kind of over preparing you with the content. And this will especially help you when you have to do outside evidence for the DBQ or you have to write your SAQs. So we're going to start first with the first unit of AP World History, which is the Global Tapestry. The Global Tapestry breaks down into 7 topics. And what I've done in this lecture is I've identified each part of the outline that relates to a specific topic in the curriculum. If you want to go to YouTube for a particular topic and look up Heimler's history and then put in the topic, there will be between a 5 and 8 minute review of that specific topic. And those can reinforce a lot of the details and add some details that I've missed. So we're going to be looking at East Asia, particularly with attention to China and the Song dynasty. We're going to look at Dar al-Islam. We're going to look at developments in South and Southeast Asia. We're going to look at state building in the Americas, state building in Africa, developments in West Europe and East Europe, and then we're going to make a comparison of these different things, and that's the historical thinking skill. And the thing is you're going to be doing that kind of as you go along. The big thing here is I would pay particular attention to East Asia and to Dar al-Islam. The other ones, you can have a general working knowledge and you'll be in good shape. So again, I'm going to be going into a little bit more detail than you probably need for the AP exam, but that's to kind of protect you and to give you a little bit more to work with. So in terms of a thematic overview of this unit, one, throughout the world, complex centralized states grew. So you have much more centralized empires or states or governments, whatever you call them. Some were continuities of previous states while others were new. So you have some states that are building off of prior states. So for example, the Byzantine Empire is really just a outgrowth of the ancient Roman Empire. The Song dynasty is built off of the previous Tang dynasty. So you have some that are just continuities. Others were just completely brand new states. And usually these new states are coming out of trade. Smaller local states, local kingdoms, local regional governments are in decline. Second, salvation-based religions emerge and displace local religious beliefs. So when we talk about salvation-based religions, we're talking about Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Confucianism. They kind of get into this universal religions. And Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity are particularly adamant about converting people to their faith. And what's happening is that local religious faiths are being kind of minimized and overrun by these bigger faiths. However, elements of local religions continued in various forms. So there will be this continuity of local religious traditions. Agricultural and technological innovation allowed support of a large population. And this is a theme we're going to see throughout world history, is that as the population of human beings grow, there has to be an accompanying, by the way, it's late, so I'm going to be stumbling over words. There has to be some type of accompanying agricultural innovation and technological innovation to sustain that increased population. Then lastly, the influence of nomadic societies declined by the 1400s as central agricultural states grew in influence. And the idea is that throughout world history, nomadic societies have helped to connect different civilizations and different cultures and allowed for the transfer of religion, transfer of ideas, the transfer of technology, the transfer of diseases, the transfer of crops. And the point that's trying to be made here is that the nomadic tribes, especially after the Mongols, no longer are really serving that role. And what's happening is that merchants and missionaries and military regimes of these central states are the ones that are going to start influencing one another. So we're seeing a transition away from nomadic groups and the rise of these powerful agricultural societies that are interacting and allowing for the spread of these various influences. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the Mongols. So that's your big ideas. If you keep these four big ideas in mind, everything else is really just example. So when we look at our examples, we have 6 major civilizations in Unit 1. In China, we have the Song Dynasty, which is a continuity of previous dynasties. The Song Dynasty is just the latest representation of government in China, based on the mandate of heaven, based on the dynastic cycle. So in China, there's 3 major technological developments. One, the building of the Grand Canal that connects the northern region to the southern region, which allows for increased interregional trade within China. Second, gunpowder. Enough said. Gunpowder, I think, is pretty obvious, the benefit or the significance of gunpowder to societies that have it. And then third, paper making. Now, gunpowder and paper making especially are going to leave China, and they're going to influence other parts of Eurasia, which is going to fuel the rise of bureaucracies, fuel the rise of gunpowder. So realize that this technology is not just staying within China. Second, the Song Dynasty has a growth of economic production. So they are creating luxury items that are in high demand throughout Afro-Eurasia, silk and porcelain products. They are also using iron and steel production to reinforce infrastructure, to reinforce bridges. And there's a commercial economy that's developed. In other words, the economy is mass producing products for sale on the international markets or within the regional markets. And this is what we call proto-industrialization. What this serves to do is to make China wealthier. And China benefits from having a large population where there are many members of that population who can dedicate their time to this type of commercial endeavors instead of spending all their time farming. Now, China's population is still primarily made up of peasants, probably about 90 to 95% of the population. But the idea that 5 to 10% are able to do non-farming jobs helps to diversify and grow the economy of China. Then we come to an agricultural innovation, champa rice. Now, champa rice is also is one of the new crops that are going to make their way into China as a consequence of the tribute system. There's also going to be lentils from India, and there's going to be other crops that come through. But champa rice is the big one because champa rice is drought resistant. It reaps itself, I guess. You can harvest it twice or 3 times a year. And champa rice is going to increase the reliance on peasant labor, but champa rice just creates more food for the population to consume, which was going to support a population growth. We also have a government based in Confucianism, such as the civil service exams. Obligations of the government are based out of a Confucian understanding of the emperor is obligated to serve the people's needs and to take care of the people. But the flip side is that the people need to be obedient to the superior government. And the idea that there's a widespread imperial bureaucracy that governs China, a complicated bureaucracy that's staffed by these Confucian scholars, and one that exerts the central authorities, power throughout the empire. And the other thing with Confucianism is that it turns into Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism is when Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism kind of combine into one expression. And that's a prominent issue or a prominent belief system of the Song Dynasty. The other thing we can put in mind and we keep in mind here is that foot binding is becoming a thing. So you want to add in the patriarchy as a potential number 5 or a number 6. Then we have the idea that China, being the big government that it is, has an impact on surrounding East Asian empires and East Asian cultures, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. The impact is all different. So you have to keep in mind that the way Vietnamese women are going to be treated is going to be different than the way Chinese women are going to be treated by virtue of cultural differences. But one thing is that the ideas of Confucianism are going to make its way into these three different countries. The concept of bureaucracy, this idea of staffing the bureaucracy with people who are powerful and as a apparatus of central control, we're going to see it in Korea and Japan and Vietnam. But in Vietnam, the bureaucrats are going to be more loyal to the village than to an emperor. In Korea, they're going to be more connected to the nobility. In Japan, they're going to be more connected to military families. So even though Confucianism and the bureaucratic concept influences everybody, it doesn't mean that these other countries produce exact copies. Paternalism, that the role of women, it's going to be different in each one, but generally speaking, women are going to be in a second-class status. The spread of Mahayana Buddhism, which, or we can also refer to it as Zen Buddhism, is an example of how Buddhism comes into China, is transformed by China, and then spreads out from China to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And then lastly, this concept of filial piety, which comes out of Confucianism, the idea that the family comes first, and the strong emphasis on the family and loyalty to one's family. So that's China in a nutshell. And the big thing you want to understand is that Song Dynasty is thriving. When we go to Dar al-Islam, we see the central political state in decay. We see the opposite thing happening. The Abbasid Caliphate, which was the central Islamic state in the Middle East and in Persia and throughout North Africa, is collapsing in about 1100 CE. And as these states are collapsing, in its place are rising Turkish states. Not necessarily all of the Abbasid Caliphate becomes a new Turkish empire, but parts of it does. And this will include the Mamluks in Egypt. The Mamluks represent a Turkish slave soldier group or slave warrior group that serves the Egyptian leaders. But then they go in the 1500s or 1400s, even further back than that, they go into a revolt. And now these Turkish slaves establish themselves as the leaders. And this is the Mamluk dynasty. In northern India, we have the Delhi Sultanate, which isn't so much an end result of the Abbasid Caliphate falling, but it represents Turkish Muslims coming into the northern part of South Asia and establishing political control in that region. The Seljuk Turks are going to come out of Central Asia and overrun Persia and other parts of the Abbasid Caliphate. But the important thing is that even though the Turkish people are coming in and establishing a new set of political governments, they are continuing the practice of Islam. And these diverse empires are still connected by this common theme of Islam, which is, of course, based off of one language called Arabic. So even though I have different governments in this region, which was once unified under the Abbasid Caliphate, I do have a common bond created by Islam and by the language of Arabic. So another thing is that Islam is going to spread. So it's going to spread throughout northern India. It's going to make its way into Southeast Asia. It's going to make its way into West Africa, which is going to increase the size of Dar al-Islam. So Dar al-Islam is not one unified government, but it is a unified culture, and that culture is based on Islam. So the three agents of Islam spread: military conquest, that's more in the 600s, 700s. Merchants are going to be a big one. Merchants are why Islam makes its way into Indonesia. Merchants are why it's going to make its way into West Africa. And then Sufi missionaries, they're very important to the spread of Islam throughout Southeast Asia and into South Asia. One of the things the Sufi missionaries are really good at doing is incorporating local beliefs and local practices in with their approach or their brand of Islam. Islam is also noted for its intellectual achievements. So the world of Islam is scientifically and medically advanced compared to other civilizations at the time. And even when the Abbasid Caliphate is falling apart, there's still this continuity and actually this flourishing of intellectual studies. And that is best exemplified by the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And the House of Wisdom is where Islamic scholars are going to come together, exchange ideas. They are going to take Greek works, ancient Greek works, and translate them into Arabic. But they're also going to work and develop those ideas to make improvements to science, mathematics, literature. So they don't just translate the works, but they also build upon it intellectually. And a lot of these ideas are going to have later influence in Western Europe. And then the technology, this is where the Islamic world is interacting with China. One of the things that they're getting from China is paper making techniques and gunpowder. And we're starting to see the birth of gunpowder weapons, such as cannons. Not to the sophistication that we see in the 1500s, but there is application of gunpowder. Now, the next major civilization we want to look at is in South and Southeast Asia. One of the big things is to understand is that there's three universal religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, that shape the societies of both South and Southeast Asia. Hinduism is going to react in response to Islam's arrival. When Islam comes in with its devotion to Allah, what's going to happen is we're going to see this, that's coming up on number 3. I was going to say the Bhakti movement. Okay, but so you have these three religions, and Hinduism is native to South Asia. Buddhism is native to South Asia, but never really grabs the population the way Hinduism does. And when Islam comes in, Islam is going to get converts from the lower caste, and they're going to get converts from the lower social classes. And that's an important thing to add in that I'm realizing I left out. One of the things about Hinduism is the idea of the caste system, which creates a social hierarchy. Now, this caste system is common throughout South Asia. So it's interesting, South Asia has regional kingdoms and has a variety of languages and a variety of dialects. Politically, it's not a unified region at this time, but it is unified through a common cultural practice, that of the caste system and religious beliefs that we would call Hinduism. When Islam comes in, Islam is going to have to kind of work with Hindu beliefs in order to appeal to the people. So we're going to see some changes, some adoption of Hindu practices within these Sufi missionaries who show up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So number 2, on the southern part of India, there's 2 empires that develop, the Chola Empire and the Vijayanagara Empire. And they're both Hindu-based states in the southern part of Asia. So they represent a political entity that is bound together through, the common religion of Hinduism. These states don't last long, and that's very typical in South Asia. Hinduism provided the basis for social continuity in South Asia, particularly with the caste system. But as Islam comes in, Hinduism starts to feel the challenge. So what happens is we have the Bhakti movement, which emphasizes devotion to people's, to personal deities and a devotion to a deity, devotion to gods. Just as the Muslims devote themselves to Allah, you're going to see in Hinduism a movement emphasizing devotion to a deity or devotion to a god. South Asian society, just like Dar al-Islam, offered intellectual contributions in both maths and science to Dar al-Islam. So the Dar al-Islam, the House of Wisdom, wasn't just building off of Greek knowledge, but they're also building off of knowledge from South Asia, particularly when it comes to mathematics. Hinduism and Buddhism are going to spread to Southeast Asia because of trade. So you're going to end up with Hindu temples in Indonesia, in present-day Cambodia. You're going to end up with Buddhist temples in Cambodia. So you're going to see the spread of that religion. And of course, it combines with local traditions and local beliefs. Now later, Islam is going to spread in about the 1200s in similar areas, especially in Indonesia. And that's an example of how merchants can spread faiths. And also, the trade that's taken place within this region is going to lead to new states. So in Indonesia, we're going to have the Majapahit or the Srivijaya Empire. So Indonesia is going to develop because of trade that is interacting through, their islands. And in what is today present day Cambodia, or what we would call Indochina in the 19th century, or what we refer to as Southeast Asia, we have the Khmer dynasty or the Khmer Empire. That is a Buddhist-based empire that sets up in present-day Cambodia. The next thing, the Americas. So the Aztec Empire is the empire to know out of Mesoamerica. So the Aztec Empire, they do something different than what we've seen. They build a tribute empire. So yes, China collected tribute from surrounding kingdoms and from surrounding tribes, but China had an extensive bureaucracy as well. The Aztecs, for the most part, do not have an extensive bureaucracy. They expect conquered people to pay tribute on a yearly basis, or the Aztec military will come in and do what needs to be done. So at best, there's probably one leader in these different tribes that are just keeping a checklist to make sure the tribute's being paid. But other than that, there's no extensive bureaucracy that the Aztecs built up. The Aztecs are also going to build off the traditions and practices of the Mayan civilization. So the Mayan civilization comes in Mesoamerica from 400 CE to 1000 CE. And their scientific advances and their religious practices are going to make their way into the Aztec civilization and heavily influence that society. The Aztecs are going to use chinampas to support agricultural productivity. Chinampas are extra land added onto land as a way of increasing farmland. But what's interesting about the Aztecs is even though they have this agricultural innovation that allows for more farmable land, they never really developed the labor force that used machines. They have to rely on human beings doing the heavy work. They don't have heavy beasts of burden, to pull plows. Human beings are doing all the work. So when they add more land, they need more people to do more work. Now in South America, we have the Inca Empire, who builds an empire through conquest, much like the Aztecs. The Inca conquer surrounding tribes and they expand their empire and their influence. But what they build up is a much more extensive bureaucracy throughout this kingdom. And they're going to move populations around to kind of create assimilation. So the Aztecs, they didn't care how these tribes lived their lives as long as they paid their tribute. The Inca, though, are going to try and create a more unified state under this bureaucracy that they build up, which is very much like a federalist system. They break up the empire into 4 quadrants, and those 4 quadrants kind of become ruled by the Inca emperor, but then each leader in the 4 quadrants are implementing the central rule. The Inca Empire also is going to use the Midas system to build up its empire, which is basically a form of labor tax, telling men from the age of 15 to 50 that they have to provide physical labor to the empire, for example, to maintain roads and bridges. And this extensive road network that connects all of the Inca Empire together is called the Carpanan. So the Carpanan are all these basically highways that connect the empire. This 2,000 mile long empire on the western coast of South America. Carpanan is going to connect it all to allow for the Inca to effectively control. And the Inca also have agricultural innovation to support their population. They have crop diversity. Since they're ruling in a mountainous terrain, they appreciate what crops grow at a higher altitude than other crops. War system, which is a way of collecting runoff water from the mountains to use as water for irrigation of crops. And again, this ties in, if you've been noticing, these innovations within agriculture allow civilizations to sustain large populations. They all have them. That's the only way they can exist. Now we go to Africa and we focus on the sub-Saharan African societies. So in Western Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, we have the Mali Empire, which is an outgrowth of the Ghana Empire, just builds on the Ghana Empire. The Mali Empire is in the middle of the trans-Saharan trade. And since they can tax the trans-Saharan trade, That allows them to generate revenue and generate growth and power. The other thing that trans-Saharan trade does is it brings Islam to the Mali Empire world. The rulers of the Mali will become Muslims, but the common people will maintain their traditional practices. So what ends up happening is you have Muslim leaders participating in non-Muslim ceremonies that are just local traditions. That's an example of a continuity of local religions. We also have the growth of cities such as Timbuktu, which becomes a leading city of scholarship as well as in trade. In the East African coast, because of the Indian Ocean trade, we have the growth of East African Swahili city-states. So as trade increases, we have these African city-states such as Mombasa that grow and develop on the eastern coast of Africa, which we call the Swahili city-states. In the southeast corner, we have the Great Zimbabwe, which is a kingdom that is able to supply raw materials to the Indian Ocean trade. So the people in the Swahili city-states that want timber, for example, go to the Great Zimbabwe and get timber in order to sell to the merchants in the Indian Ocean. As a consequence, the Great Zimbabwe grows in power and influence. Up in the northeast section, you have Ethiopia. Ethiopia is off of the Red Sea, so they are going to be more influenced by the Mediterranean world. And the biggest way we see this influence is in the widespread conversion of Christianity within Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, we're talking 1200 to 1450, is a Christian state amidst Muslim states. By now, Islam has taken a lot of that region, and we've seen a lot of conversion over to Islam. Yet Ethiopia maintains its Christian heritage. And then along the Niger River, in what is today Nigeria, we have the Hassa kingdoms. And the Hassa kingdoms are engaged in this trade that's going on, the trans-Saharan trade. And that trade generates wealth for these individual kingdoms. And these kingdoms are going to pull together to kind of provide mutual defense. But otherwise, they maintain a certain degree of independence. And then lastly, in Europe, with the West Europe, what we want to understand is that West Europe is definitely on the outside of Afro-Eurasia. They're on the periphery. They're not heavily engaged in the trade that's going on. They don't have the same agricultural innovations that we see going on in other parts of the globe. And we have this form called feudalism. What feudalism does is it creates a decentralized political and social structure. So you can apply feudalism to both political concepts, where local landlords get loyalty from others in exchange for land in order to build up popularity and support. But we can also tie this into serfdom and the idea that peasant farmers or workers are going to come onto the lands of the lords and exchange labor for protection. And that's going to create the system of serfdom, which is really nothing more than a form of coerced labor. Now, feudalism and serfdom is going to be going on till about the Black Death. And in Western Europe, it's going to start to diminish after the Black Death. We'll talk about why later. The Crusades are an example from 1095 to 1284. There's a series of crusades that seeks to take back the Holy Land for the Catholic Church. And what this does is it represents West Europe starting to step out of its own little world. And when we start seeing the arrival of West Europeans into the Middle East, we start seeing an interaction between the Western Christians, who are often called the Franks by the people in the Middle East. You have these West Europeans who are now in the Middle East interacting with the Islamic world and with the merchants and the activity that's always been going on. And so what that does, the Crusade starts to expose West Europe to this broader world, which is going to drive further development later. Roman Catholicism is the religion that's going to kind of unify all of West Europe. So West Europe is just small little kingdoms, and they are competing with each other. The one thing all these small kingdoms have in common is that they're all Catholic, and they all answer to the Pope. But this also creates a competition between the church and the state. So the local political authorities don't always like the church telling them what to do. The church is trying to exert pressure on these local authorities to toe the church line or to toe the Catholic wishes. And that sets up a tension. But what's going on in the 1200s and 1300s is we're seeing a push to centralization, basically, where central kings are becoming stronger, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire. And as a consequence of this centralization, we also see it in England a little bit. As a consequence of this centralization, local lords, local nobility are losing power. Now, in Britain, these local nobility create a thing called the Magna Carta as a way of keeping the king in check. But in France, the local nobility are definitely losing power to the king. And in the Holy Roman Empire, the German princes are trying to maintain autonomy from a Holy Roman emperor. So not only do we see competition between the states of West Europe, but we also see competition between the levels within West Europe, between the king and the nobility. And then finally, the arrival of the bubonic plague is going to create significant damage to West Europe, not just in human population dropping off, but in the decline of the urban cities initially. Now, what's interesting is that in the long run, the Black Death is going to change things dramatically, because what happens is that the Black Death is going to contribute to a scarcity of labor. Basically, with all these people dying off, the landlords double down on serfdom, and they say, we need more rules and more restrictions against these workers to keep them in line. But the workers realize that they have a tremendous amount of power because their labor is in demand. They start creating demands for better rights, for better treatment. And this is going to lead to peasant revolts, to uprisings against serfdom. And particularly in England and France, we're going to see the end of serfdom as these land workers are granted more rights and privileges because their labor is becoming more scarce. The other thing is that cities are actually going to recover down the long run, down the road, because what happens is that the populations in the cities are getting wiped out by the bubonic plague. But eventually, and so trade initially declines. What's going to happen is that people from the countryside will come into the cities for business opportunities, and we'll see a resurgence of trade and activity later in the 1400s. The other thing that I should have put in here is the development of this little ice age from 1300 to 1800, which represents a global cooling. And if you're in like the more tropical zones of the earth, you're not really affected. The growing season isn't really affected by a drop in a couple degrees. But in West Europe, the drop of a couple of degrees shortens the growing season and starts to make food even more scarce. And what that does is it creates another pressure that Europe is going to be dealing with from 1300 to 1800, this little ice age. So between the little ice age stressing out the food supply and the Black Death causing massive deaths, there's a high level of stress on the society of West Europe, especially in the 1300s. In East Europe, we have the Byzantine Empire, which is just the eastern part of the Roman Empire continuing. So the Byzantine Empire sets itself very much like the Roman Empire that it comes from. But the big thing about the Byzantine Empire is that it's engaged in the trade activity of the Afro-Eurasian world. And it is definitely connecting the Islamic world to other parts of the world. So the Byzantine Empire is very actively engaged. To them, West Europe is the backwaters. West Europe is the sticks. They look eastward for the action. So the Byzantine Empire is very much interconnected with the rest of the globe. And one of the significant things that the Byzantine Empire will do is expand its influence north into present-day Ukraine, creating the Kiev Rus states. Now, actually, the Kiev Rus states were already in development. There are a series of city-states that are developing in present-day Ukraine, with Kiev being one of the major city-states. But what happens is trade with the Byzantine Empire will promote the spread of Orthodox Christianity to the Slavic people of the Ukraine and of Eastern Europe. And we see that spread of Orthodox Christianity into that region, which changes the culture dramatically. And what Kiev Rus, of course, sets up is the rise of the Russian state later. Okay, so quick little comparisons. When you think about comparing these, think about the way states are being built, the type of state buildings. Some states are emerging from new situations, such as the Vijaya Empire, and such as I'm sorry, the Khmer Empire of Cambodia. Some are revivals of old empires, such as the Song Dynasty. Some are synthesis of different traditions. In other words, for example, the Ghana Empire evolves into the Mali Empire, which is bringing together the Muslim traditions along with the local traditions. But all of them are expanding in scope. In other words, they're reaching more people between 1200 and 1450. Now, of course, some of these new states are growing out of old ones, such as the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate that leads to the emergence of the Mamluk and the Seljuk Turk empires. So you want to see that there's different ways these states build. All of them incorporate the idea of change and continuity. In other words, there are some traditions that carry on even though these new states are forming. So for example, the continuity of the local traditions of the Mali people, despite the fact that the Mali Empire has changed into an Islamic empire. And then you get into this idea that the role of religion in governing states, is still prominent. There's the idea that Confucianism is being used to reinforce the political authority of the state, that Islam is being used to reinforce the political validity of the leaders throughout these various kingdoms. And when we look at Hinduism and how it becomes the basis for states that form in Southern Asia, the idea is that religion is still very much connected to state ruling, and that's always been the case. That's a continuity. And then lastly, systems of labor. In Western Europe, we have coerced labor everywhere. And some countries rely more on slavery than others. All of them require somebody to work the land for the people who own the land. Now in China, this will be peasant labor. In West Europe, before the Black Death, it's serfdom. So you have this idea that there are people working the land and there's people who own the land. And the people working the land, in a way, are providing labor in exchange for keeping some of the production of the land for themselves. And that system's pretty consistent across Afro-Eurasia. But also, we talk about systems of labor, we can see the value of merchants varying. In China, merchants were considered lower than low. But in the Islamic world, merchants had a much higher status. So the idea of how merchants are treated differently across the places is something to keep in mind as well. All right, so that's unit 1. And again, to me, China and the Dar al-Islam is definitely 2 that I take the time to really get to know. Not so much for the multiple choice, because the multiple choice can be anything, but really for the writing. I think that will come in very handy. All right, unit 2, networks of exchange. So there's 7 topics here. And I'm going to organize this not topic by topic, but kind of thematically. But if you want to refer to Heimler's history, here's what you would do. Silk Roads is topic 2.1. Then you go to the Mongols. Then we talk about the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And then we talk about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. What you want to be able to do for those 3 different networks is talk about what is trading and what is spreading beyond just goods along those things, and what new technologies are being developed. So what religions are being spread, what new technologies are being developed, and what type of goods are being produced. And then we want to look at the cultural consequences of connectivity. How is culture affected by this interaction that these networks of exchange promote? And we also want to look at the environmental consequences of connectivity. And then lastly, we want to do a comparison of these 3 major trade routes. So there's a lot there to unpack. So let's go to it. So first of all, let's talk about the Mongol Empire. So this is topic 2.2, but let's just start with the Mongols because they kind of segue from the last unit to this unit. They are the last of the great nomadic empires. There's nothing going to be this great again for nomadic peoples. There's this leader named Genghis Khan who is going to promote religious tolerance. He's going to promote meritocracy, but he's also going to centralize control. One of the and also he's a brutal warrior who doesn't screw around. He's also a huge promoter of trade, and that's going to become very important later. So he holds the merchants in high esteem, and he wants to create, because he knows that mercantile activity means money for him. Now, after Genghis Khan dies, he doesn't create the extensive bureaucracy to keep this large kingdom together. His kingdom eventually falls into four khanates: the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde that collects tribute from the Russian city states, and Chagatai, which is in Central Asia. So the consequences of the Mongols is the more important thing to focus on. One, it promotes cultural exchange across Eurasia because the Mongol Empire connects a variety of societies together, and they move these people around. They take skilled carpenters out of East Europe and send them into the Middle East. They take Persian bureaucrats and they send them into China. So they're moving people around, and as a result, culture moves around as well. They promote religious tolerance. So, they had their own animistic faiths, but later in the Ilkhanate, you're going to see the adoption of Islam by the Mongols. And that brings me to the next thing: the adoption and rejection of local practices. So, when the Mongols come into China, they adopt the practice of a mandate of heaven. Kublai Khan, who's a grandson of Genghis Khan, says, I have the mandate of heaven, and he rules as a traditional Chinese emperor. But he rejects the practice of promoting Confucian scholars within the bureaucracy. And what he does is he imports Persian bureaucrats to run the bureaucracy of China. So he's rejecting that local practice. The other thing the Mongols do in China as a rejection of local practices is the rejection of foot binding, and also a separation of the Chinese people from the Mongols. The Mongols outlaw, basically they outlaw the Chinese from learning the Mongolian language, and the Mongols don't learn the Chinese language. The Mongols also forbid marriage between the two groups because the Mongols want to maintain that separation from the Chinese. In the case of the Ilkhanate, we see a lot more adoption because now the Mongols are in what used to be Persia. And what happens is that these descendants of the Mongol conquerors become agriculturalists. They start to own farms and they grow food, which is not what nomadic people do. And they also convert to Islam. And they become very adamant and passionate believers of the faith. And later, they're going to play a role in developing land-based empires within that area. The other thing to keep in mind is, when we talk about the consequences, is the growth of trade on the Silk Road and financial innovation. So what happens is the Mongols provide the security and safety to promote trade along the Silk Road. And the Silk Road opens back up. The Silk Road becomes safer and it becomes more active under the Mongols. Because what the Mongols are doing is basically saying, if you attack anybody on this, if you attack a merchant, we kill you and your whole village. So the Mongols enforced what we call the Pax Mongolica, which is the peace of the Mongols. But the Mongols also are going to promote financial innovations, such as paper money, which originates in China, but it's something the Mongols will promote. They're also going to protect bankers, banking houses. They're going to promote flying credit or flying cash, which is really a form of credit. The Mongols are going to promote financial rules that they enforce that encourage trade. But the other thing is that by connecting China to Europe, essentially through the Silk Roads, the bacterial infection that causes the bubonic plague is going to spread along with it. And so as the trade opens up, we have this interaction between China now and the European states, the Mediterranean world, through the Silk Roads, the bubonic plague is going to not only spread in West Europe, but is also going to hammer China. So that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have that interaction. There's one other consequence that I think you can add in this is that this becomes the basis for future land-based states. So for example, the Golden Horde, who are collecting tribute from the Russian city-states, in a way are laying the foundation for the future Russia state. And the Russian state is going to copy a lot of the Mongolian practices that becomes the basis for their government and military. Now, if we look at the three networks of trade, the Silk Road connects the Mediterranean world to China through land routes. So that means it's going to be largely luxury-based goods because land routes are long travel. So you're not taking stuff that's going to sell cheap. You're going to take the stuff that's expensive. So the very name Silk Road tells you the biggest thing that was being traded, namely silk products. The Indian Ocean routes, which is a water-based route system, connects Africa and Asia with not only luxury items, but also raw materials. One of the things that promotes the trade along the Indian Ocean trade network is the knowledge of monsoon wind patterns, which becomes critical to understanding how the winds are blowing so that you can plan your trips. Predictable travel is safer travel. Safer travel is more travel. More travel means more trade. More trade means more profit. And then in West Africa, connecting the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa are the trans-Saharan trade networks. Now, the trans-Saharan trade routes, they rely on the knowledge of oasis. You're walking through a desert, knowing where the oasis is, which is the supply of fresh water, is critical to success. If you don't know and you get lost, you're done for. So traveling the Sahara Desert requires a knowledge of the natural world. That's critical. The trans-Saharan trade is largely the gold salt trade, where gold that is being mined in West Africa, particularly in the Mongol Empire, is sought after in the Northern and the Middle East nations. The West Africa does not have a natural source of salt, so they are looking for salt. Basically, salt is worth its weight in gold. And the taxation of that gold salt trade is what drives the growth of the Mongol Empire. There's also the trade of enslaved peoples. Now, at this point, most of those peoples would probably be female because the enslaved population would be working in wealthy houses. So we don't have this chattel slavery concept yet. But we do have this practice of the exchange of enslaved people along this trade route. All three of them, this is the important thing, they grew in activity. There's simply more trade happening all over them between 1200 and 1450. They all promoted the growth of cities and states. When trade routes intersect, at the intersection, cities will grow. And there's also states that grow, such as the Srivijaya, which grows in Indonesia because of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So you have cities that grow, you have states that grow because of this trade. And it also is going to promote cultural activity, which we will talk about in a moment. So the next thing, the consequence of exchange. First, cultural exchange. Religions are going to spread along these trade routes. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, we can also add in Christianity. So one consequence of exchange is that religion is going to spread. And the faiths that are being spread are these universal salvation faiths that are especially advocated by missionaries as well as by merchants. Of course, we get products that are changing hands. So items that are produced in China are finding their way to West Europe, for example. So luxury items like silk and porcelain, spices that come out of the Southeast Asian islands of the Indonesian island chains, fabrics, I just said that with silk. Animals, horses in particular, are in high demand in many of these trade routes. But also technological innovation is going to make its way across these trade routes. The knowledge of gunpowder and paper making is going to spread along the Silk Roads. While maritime innovations such as the compass, the lateen sail, the sternpost rudder, and the astrolabe are going to spread from the Indian Ocean from China through the Indian Ocean up to the Mediterranean. The magnetic compass, for example, is a Chinese invention that becomes highly popular throughout the the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and then gets introduced to the Mediterranean world and becomes part of the growth of West European expansion. And then we have the role of diasporic communities. So, this is no different than now. People like to live close to where they work. So merchants are going to set up homes away from their homes where the business is active, and that just makes sense. But what they're going to do is maintain their traditions and maintain their cultures in a foreign land. And they'll form communities of like people. So you might have Arab merchants who travel across the Indian Ocean and establish a settlement in China. And they're just engaging in business, but they are Arab origins, they have Muslim traditions, they have that Middle Eastern culture that they bring with them. And it's not like all of China suddenly becomes, Islamic, but they influence each other. And particularly when you look at architecture, how buildings reflect the receiving society within the diaspora communities. Then we have environmental exchanges. Crops are moving across these trade networks. And plants that are not indigenous to an area will be cultivated in a new area. For example, champa rice, indigenous to Vietnam, cultivated heavily in the northern parts of China. Bananas, which get introduced from Indonesia and comes into especially East Africa, which is going to sustain a population boom amongst the Bantu people. Sugar is going to become a very important crop that we're going to follow in the next couple of units. And sugar is going to make its way out into the Middle East throughout the Mediterranean because it's in such high demand by Europeans. And citrus fruits are another thing that comes out of the Middle East and works its way into places like Italy, for example. All of this environmental exchange has an impact on the environment. Overgrazing to support larger populations, deforestation to create more agricultural land, and soil erosion are going to impact the environment. And that leads you to an idea that human beings alter the environment to suit their needs. So we will plant crops that are not indigenous to one area. We will plant those crops if we think it's good for us. And we will alter the environment to try and make that work out. And then the other environmental exchange, of course, is the bubonic plague, which is a form of bacterial exchange. So this exchange of disease, which is going to be another thing we see when people interact, whether it be the bubonic plague here, smallpox going into the Americas, or the spread of COVID-19, or the spread of the influenza pandemic of 1918. Diseases connect with the interaction of peoples, particularly pandemic or epidemic diseases. Okay, I believe these are the last two. Financial developments are already touched on. So the importance of strong states to commerce. The Islamic states and the Mongols provided security and stability that encouraged safe trade. When there's safe trade, there's more trade. And concepts like the flying cash, which is really just nothing more than a form of credit, banking houses, and paper money are all financial innovations that spread along these trade routes and gets implemented by other people. Technological advances are also going to spread. So for example, in the Silk Road and in the trans-Saharan trade, camels are critical to this activity. So developing saddles that allow the camel to carry more weight, to distribute the weight more equally so that the camel can carry the weight, is going to allow for greater trade, because now I can carry more products. I can carry more stuff back to sell it off, which is more profit. But also the concept of the caravan, the idea that it's not going to be one merchant with one camel, but rather a caravan of 100, 1,500, hundreds, if not a couple thousand of these camels and merchants. And now people are pulling their resources together in order to reap greater profits. So they're kind of working together through cooperation in order to engage in greater economic activity. And if you think to the 20th century, we see countries pulling together to create regional economic networks for that same reason. But we also have this concept of the caravanserai, which is basically rest stops along trade routes. So there's a rest stop, and then a day's journey, there's another rest stop. And these things start to pop up as a way of supporting trade. And then, of course, the improved knowledge of monsoon patterns and oases represent an advance, a technological advance, because this allows for trade to be more predictable and safer. Now, as we look at the last thing, writing an SAQ, that's something we'll talk about in class. So that takes us through units 1 and 2. So unit 1, the global tapestry, get to know these 6 different states and get to know their political, economic, and religious aspects or characteristics, and compare and contrast them. That's one big thing to do, but also talk about continuity and change, how some things stay the same and how some things represent an innovation. And then for your unit 2, focus on the trade routes and also the consequences of interaction, which is a theme we will play through AP World History. So this interactions, it's not just that goods are being exchanged, but new ways of doing business, new technologies, new religions are being introduced and having an impact on a variety of people. So that's time period 1 from 1200 to 1450. I will see you soon for time period 2, which takes us from 1450 to 1750. So again, if you ever have any questions, just reach out and let me know, and I will see you soon. Bye.